Okay, so now it's time for a panel of questions and answers. I take this opportunity and I will have one question for each of our amazing speakers. And I would like to start with Jakob. So, according to you, Jakob, and also from conceptual point of view, what does grassroots sport and diplomacy have in common? Because when people think of diplomacy in the traditional understanding, they think of something elitist, state-led, top-down, exclusive, which has nothing to do with grassroots. On the other hand, we have grassroots sport, which is like rather a civil society-led, open, bottom-up phenomena. So what did you have in mind when you invented the grassroots sport diplomacy concept?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I'll pass it on to the other ones. I think fundamentally we are here to change diplomacy. Obviously, we want to change and learn ourselves in the grassroots sports sector, but I think you're making a valid point. We want diplomacy to change. In fact, it has been changing from that very traditional point of view to something that we can call public diplomacy, which is also about engaging with citizens and influencing public views. But I think the grassroots sport diplomacy is embodying a totally different set of values. And we talk about, and I think it was very valid points made, that yes, we can look at the interests of different states and nations in a negative sense, being oriented towards winning trade wars, winning real wars, influencing with my values upon yours. And I think we should not try to be value-free. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to say that we may have some different values. And can we look at this from a more multilateral perspective, one of generosity, one of wanting to give and meet people on the same level? I think there's something here that we can be proud of and maybe even influence diplomacy as we go forward. If we try to take some of the values of grassroots sport and try to put them into diplomatic actions, then maybe it's not going to be America first or Brexit out, whatever. Can we look at giving before we look to take something? And I think that's what grassroots sport is doing, and that whole voluntary piece in grassroots sport is very nice. It's about giving something. Can we get that to be used? Then we've come a long way, I think.
Thank you. All right, Richard, in your opinion, what is the future of EU sport diplomacy? We had some very nice achievements with the high-level group on sports diplomacy and also with the council conclusions on sport diplomacy under the Slovak presidency and 2 seminars. But what is the next step? So will you ever see the EU, the European Union, as a strong actor in the field of sport diplomacy and sport for development and peace? And also, do you think that grassroots sport can be some kind of European soft power?
Well, as I said in my presentation, sport diplomacy is the new kid on the block when it comes to the European Union. It's got great political momentum behind it, great political impetus. It's got a funding stream behind it as well that I'd encourage those of you who are from EU countries or partner countries to look into because the budget for Erasmus Plus is expanding, the opportunities are there, and one of the themes that we've been looking at today is that this shouldn't be a top-down approach. I outlined the European Union's approach, its strategy, and it's important that we're aware of that, but really the momentum and the initiative has got to come from below, not above. So I think things are looking positive, but it's only been a blink of an eye for EU sports diplomacy. It's only just started, and priorities can change. The EU work plan that prioritises sports diplomacy will end in 2020. We'll have a new European Commissioner responsible for education and culture. She has a huge portfolio to deal with. It's by no means certain that sports diplomacy will be prioritised. I know that the new Commissioner has made public utterances that grassroots sport will become a priority, and let's hope so, but her portfolio is enormous. And so in terms of the political impetus at the top, I think there are still, there are still some questions. Now, one thing that concerns me when I talk about sport diplomacy is that we think it's a win-win situation, and I think largely it is, but there are some dangers associated with sports diplomacy. There are some obstacles associated with sports diplomacy, and these are going to be played out at European level. I've already mentioned the Commissioner and maybe changing of priorities. I don't think that will be the case. I think that it is now on the agenda. There are still plenty of people out there who think sport and politics don't mix. Personally, I think that ship sailed long ago. When we talk about sport and diplomatic initiatives, we only have to look at the recent football match between Bulgaria and England, with the racist abuse of some of the English players. Now, England cannot moralize about this issue because we've had significant problems in the past and we're still experiencing significant problems. But this illustrates that it's not always so easy to use sport in a diplomatic context. And then FIFA, of course, have looked at the reaction of the Bulgarian government to this situation and the calls on the head of the Bulgarian Football Association to resign, and that engages their statutes on political interference. So this can quickly become quite a murky business and quite a difficult business. And I don't think we should necessarily shy away from these difficult questions when it comes to the connection between sport and diplomacy. But my final point would be, as I ended, I think it's for the grassroots world to develop a bottom-up initiative. I think the door is open at the European level. And as Sylvia said, rather than wait for governments to frame strategies, it should be for the grassroots movement to do that. And I think there are plenty of opportunities at the European level, the European Union level, to do that.
Thank you. Aaron, Australia has the most progressive sport diplomacy strategies in the world. And you are still developing something more, the Australian Sports Diplomacy Knowledge Hub, which is pretty interesting, I think, also for us and also for the grassroots sector. So can you tell us how the grassroots sport will be involved in this knowledge hub, the grassroots sport organizations, NGOs, and how can we actually learn from the Australian practice?
Yes, well, the creation of the Sports Diplomacy Knowledge Hub was, to my knowledge, the first attempt in the world to create an umbrella for everything that could be characterised as sports diplomacy to gather under. So in the format of the strategy, the Australian government strategy, it's 4 different pillars, and I can't remember them exactly off the top of my head, but essentially it's the traditional diplomatic channels and agencies, that is to say the government-led side. There is the sports side of things, so the actual sporting teams that are actually travelling internationally for elite competition. There is sport for development / grassroots sport, and then there is sport as business, so architects who are designing international stadiums or people who are doing wearable technology or whatever. And part of the tension, the challenge, the difficult thing to nail down about the future of sports diplomacy, from my perspective, having given many hundreds of hours to putting that knowledge hub together, is essentially you are democratising the process, and the diplomatic ambitions of somebody who's a wearable tech guy versus somebody who wants to address non-communicable diseases in Tonga versus somebody who wants to do some old school diplomacy but do it at a rugby game, then they all have potentially different motivations and challenges. So I'm personally very excited. I think it could be a historic document, but it is fair to say all it is a field guide, and how it will actually manifest, time will tell.
Thank you. And Sylvia, you participated in the Sports United program, right? And then, as far as I'm concerned, the Sports United program also has a sub-program called Sports Visitors, and they are specifically reaching out to underserved, disadvantaged youngsters all across the world, and also the US government, in a way, uses grassroots sport and youth sports to engage with these youngsters. In your opinion, how can you convince the government of North Macedonia to rely on grassroots sport organizations and NGOs like TACT, and how can you convince them to build a sport diplomacy strategy on grassroots sport rather than on elite sport?
Well, it will be challenging, definitely, because working with any government, it's not an easy process. But I think that we have this experience and this knowledge about grassroots sports diplomacy, and they have been following us from governmental level, and they know the results that we have achieved in such a short period of time. It's impossible to be achieved on a different level. And I think that they realize as well that when you promote people-to-people dialogue and people-to-people diplomacy, it's very effective. And this is where it matters the most. You know, when we reach out to those marginalized communities and we change their opinions and thinking, and we promote understanding and acceptance, that's very powerful, because it really has to start at a very, very grassroots level, especially with marginalized communities. This is where we work the most. Of course, elite sport is very meaningful, it's very impactful, because you have mega events, but it can turn to be also very controversial and very negative as well. I think that being a country, living in a country, the Balkan region, where we had many conflicts in the past, and just realizing that through grassroots sports diplomacy, we can overcome those differences. And again, we can see right in front of our eyes that young people from different communities, they speak, they bond, they ask themselves what are their interests, what is their difference, how we can go together, how we can create something together. That's so powerful that any government, you can't go against that. It's so right in front of your eyes. It's so effective and efficient that I think that any person with a reasonable sense will support that.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate your input. Now I would like to open the floor for questions, and we have some amazing volunteers here as well. We'll bring you the mic if you have any questions, so please ask anything that you want from any of the speakers here, and don't be shy. So already, first question. You can address the whole panel or one specific.
Yes, this is directed to Sylvia, but of course the rest of the panel members feel free to chip in. You mentioned something about sports being more powerful than politics, which is true. Because actually athletes represent more than just sports and entertainment. However, what is your view on the negative way that politics, in quotes, sports politics, respond to sports diplomacy from athletes? And the case in mind is the Colin Kaepernick case in the US, where he's trying to address the social injustice to Afro-Americans and the way he has been treated. So what is your opinion about that?
I mean, just like Richard said, you can't take out politics from sport. Politics and sport are very much connected. Sports diplomacy can be something very positive, and yet it can be something very controversial and something very negative. It depends from which angle you look, and depends also, it very much depends of the strategies and of the, let's say, of the athletes at a very high level. If they, according to me, they should be, most of the athletes, we should run programs for them, for sports diplomacy, and educate them that they don't just play the game, but they represent their whole state and culture, and so much is at stake. Now, there hasn't been any program, to my knowledge, aimed at elite athletes where they have to fully realize how powerful they are and how important their role they play, not only in sport, but in society is as well. They have to be taught about what kind of message they need to deliver when they go out on the pitch, or even after the pitch. If we have this kind of programs, educational programs about elite athletes, I think that we will really diminish the negative aspect of sports diplomacy that has been going on for years. And it's a very controversial area, but yet I think we have to address it in this way. Because sports athletes are so powerful, their work is in a public place. So they really need to be taught about the responsibilities they carry on their back when they play sport at such a high level.
Thanks. Next question.
Hello, my name is Thomas. I'm from the DGI in Denmark. And I think I'm hearing that we're talking about two different things. There's grassroots sports diplomacy and sports diplomacy. And I think if we want athletes to do sports diplomacy, then we need to start at a grassroots level. So where do you see that movement? How do we connect to the club, having kids, teaching them how to be inclusive, how to address gender issues, other stuff, and growing it from there? And how do you see that journey from the grassroots level to the sports diplomacy? Yeah, and I think maybe Jakob.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the fundamental question here is, and I think it's been brought up, so we may have a little bit of an interesting conversation here. Do we want to talk about grassroots sport diplomacy as a part of sports diplomacy, or is it fundamentally different from these sport diplomacy initiatives that we've seen before? And I think, Richard, you said something interesting, provocative even, to say that we are seeing a sport theater, a political theater with a sporting backdrop of sorts. Sometimes you bring these elite athletes in to shake hands with political decision makers, and they leave and everybody is happy, at least in the media. I don't buy it, I don't like it, and I think there are some fundamental discrepancies also in the values between professional, elite and grassroots sports. And I think we need to be able to talk openly about those things. So are we trying to promote things where citizens have equal value and need to learn good, inclusive manners? Or are we talking about a game where the winner takes it all and the one that stands on the top of stage is the most important one? Now, I think we need to understand some of these differences in perspective, and I would advocate that we need to be a little bit provocative and say this is different. This is a new perspective, and we need to take that more community-based, bottom-up approach rather than trying to tag on and maybe make a little bit of an added value to a nice Olympic Games sort of situation. No offense, but still, that's my perspective. And I'm sure these should have a chance to reply as well. Thank you.
If you want to.
The only thing that I would add to that, and I think all of those are precisely on point, is to say that I actually think it's a point of power or leverage for grassroots sports, because in many ways it's very high stakes but also low stakes. That is to say, if somebody in your grassroots clinic tweets something, it's unlikely to become an international diplomatic incident in the way we've seen happen with one or two other things. But in terms of the values exchange and the opportunity, the values exchange as articulated by Jakob, and the deep and abiding relationships that operate far deeper and far more personally than an international, interstate relationship, those are the compelling points of difference that grassroots has as an advantage, in my opinion.
And Richard.
I would agree with you if you're defining sports diplomacy in the traditional sense, as I described it, political theatre with a sporting backdrop, the photograph opportunity, the shaking of hands with a sports star, that kind of thing. But what I think I was trying to talk about was new sports diplomacy, which is more inclusive, which brings in a much wider range of actors. because traditional sports diplomacy has lost, well, traditional diplomacy has lost its way. People don't connect with it. And sport is one way that people are beginning to realize actually that you can now amplify diplomatic messages through these softer mechanisms. And it goes back to Sylvia's point about education as well, because if you want to be a traditional diplomat, you've got to go to university, you've got to get your master's degree, you train to be a diplomat, you're very well trained. Sportsmen and women are not trained to be diplomats, naturally. And so there is some reluctance to connect those levels, as you referred to, between grassroots sport, sport diplomacy, and sport diplomacy or traditional public diplomacy. But my message to the European Union is, if it wants to develop a sports diplomacy strategy, which it looks like it is doing, don't go down the road of the old traditional diplomacy. Really try and connect with this people-to-people approach that I think all of us have been discussing today.
Thanks. Next question. There was one here, right? Or there in the back first, and then here.
Yeah, thank you. Daniela Conti from WISP, the Italian Sport for All Association. Thank you all for the very good and inspiring presentation. Just two things about how much is important for us grassroots diplomacy in Italy, but in general in our organization, because we use a lot grassroots association to combat barriers that we've got in sport, especially the first speaker told about the barrier, institutional barriers in amateur sport that migrants and refugees has got. And we are winning throughout campaigning, starting from the grassroots level, from associations who start playing only with refugees and push and knock at the door of the federation, asking a recognizing of these people to play sport at all level, and especially at amateur league. But I want also to underline that today we can also face a new challenge, because in Italy, and I think in other parts of the world, is starting a campaign to stop the final match in Istanbul, because Turkey attacked the Kurdistan. So there are many popular sport associations who is demanding this to top-level sport as a sign of respect of victims. So I think that this could be also a good message, can start from Move Congress, because I think that sport, as you said, unify people, is really a place in which people can meet each other, but can also mark a sign and to say something very strong. Say, this is just a question, if we can do this as an organization, as ISCA, people and family. Thanks a lot.
Anybody?
Yeah, that's good. You know, the family thing is not my thing, because there's an Olympic family, and sometimes things get a little bit too cuddly in that. But I appreciate the point. I think the Move Congress is an example of grassroots sports diplomacy for a smaller group of people, but you guys are change makers and diplomats in your own right, I think. And if you can be part of a movement whereby we want to meet and make other people meet each other across borders and create those friendships, I think that's a fantastic achievement. Better than most of the stuff I see, because it was pointed out too that sport and sport diplomacy can be as harmful as it can be good, and we can make a lot of mistakes, but you guys will do it much better than most, I think. So if Move Congress can be a stepping stone for that, I think that's great. And don't be afraid to say, well, diplomacy, I didn't take an education on that level, I didn't go to school, I didn't work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Honestly speaking, you know, when I walk through these meeting rooms and I see people at the breaks, we meet people from very different cultures, and they meet and greet in an open, trustful fashion, which means, it doesn't mean that it's not funny or strange or difficult for a person from China to meet and greet with a person from Canada. We need to find how to do that. But it works out, doesn't it? We don't need to take an education to do that, because it's human. So I think Move Congress and ISCA can have a role to play here, and what really matters, honestly speaking, are the great things that WISP is doing in Lebanon and the great things that Sylvia is doing in North Macedonia and Kosovo. These are the actions that matter the most.
Yeah, I will just add on that, that I think that Move Congress is a perfect platform to start the advocacy about grassroots sports diplomacy. Because all here in this room, we've heard about the power of sports diplomacy, that all of us, each of us, we can be sports diplomats. Now, we can start in our own context, but we are the advocates. We should take out from here and do the first advocacy steps about grassroots sports diplomacy in the context and within the communities that we live in.
Thank you, man. Unfortunately, we only have time for one last question because we are running out of time. So please,
Thank you.
go ahead.
I'm Nikos. I'm representing the European Network of Active Living for Mental Health. I would like to propose to be a little bit realistic and to continue this discussion only under the precondition that when we speak about sport diplomacy, the grassroots dimension is on top and it covers and ensures the right use of all this idea that can become an actual movement. I had a very important experience 1 year ago when in a grassroots events that took place in Athens participated 14 countries. The whole event was focused on the use of sports and physical exercise in mental health. One of the participating countries was Turkey. And it was a very pleasant surprise when, as during the event, documentary film was shooting, I mentioned his statement that we come from different countries, we have problems between us, obviously. He says so because the event took place in Athens, but we have sports. And it was very important because due to my age, this word remind me the famous lyrics of Leonard Cohen when written for Janis Joplin. We are ugly, but we have the music. We have problems, but we have sports. Why I'm underlining this? Because 3 days ago, the national football team of Turkey, following an official and state diplomacy, greeted their audience in a military way. That means that we have to protect our approach that is focused on grassroots sport diplomacy and not to be involved in any kind of public diplomacy because our intentions, our movement is for the time being a little weak to face all the power that states have, countries have, or any other kind of entities that can interfere this. We keep this grassroots on top of our mind. Thank you.
Anybody wants to reflect on this?
Was there a question, Nikos? Thank you for that. It's very interesting. I actually disagree. I fundamentally think that we from the grassroots sports sector need to go into partnerships, to go into conversations and to be very firm on our values with those governments, with those entities, and try to influence them. Because we can do our own diplomatic actions, and we do, and it's great. But if you really want to have an impact, let's try to influence these other guys. And I really feel, I did say that grassroots sport is a small sector, but look at it from this perspective. This is the biggest sector when it comes to civil society engagement. It's the biggest sector when it comes to numbers that are involved. You can look at how many people are participating in the mega events and how many people are actually being active and compare those things. We have leverage in the numbers and in the citizens-to-citizens approach, and I think we should use that to reinforce some of our values in the difficult conversations with people that may not actually do things that we feel appreciative of. So it's very important at point to stay firm on the grassroots sport and the grassroots sport values, but I would advocate that we should take those values also to the ones we don't agree with.
All right, so I imagine that everybody is super hungry now, so we are going to practice some kind of diplomacy based on Hungarian gastronomy. And I would really like to thank our speakers for their really nice contributions, and I also thank the audience here for having taken part in the first part of the Grassroots Sport Diplomacy track, because after the lunch, at 1:45, we are going to continue this Grassroots Sport Diplomacy track with the more practical approach. So we are going to teach you how to be grassroots sport diplomats, and we are also going to showcase some very good pilot actions that were developed within the frameworks of the Grassroots Sport Diplomacy project. Nevertheless, if you are really curious about these projects, you can go to the Innovation Alley and you can find some of our presenters there who are going to talk about their pilot actions. So I really thanks one more, and I hope that we are going to see most of you here in the second section of the Grassroots Sport Diplomacy track. And here we have some very small presents for our wonderful speakers. So thanks. And then see you at 1:45 here in the same room. Thank you.